Why history? Why history? Why do I do history? Why do I study history? And actually, why do I teach history? Is it because of my grandpa? Is it because of my family? Is it because of the history of our country? Is it because of curiosity about events in the history of our country and events in my family history? History, it's mainly something that I've always been curious about. I'm a curious person anyway, but I've always been curious about the history of our country and where we came from and how we grew, beginning with the fact that I have a person with the same last name who signed the Declaration, William Whipple. I don't know if he's actually a relative. I've looked through Ancestry. I can't find a connection. I know that William Whipple died in his 50s and never had children. So if he were connected, he'd have to be a cousin, something of that order. Haven't looked back that far, but it's always made me curious, that name on the Constitution. And from that, I've developed other curiosities. Mostly my curiosity and my quest for looking into history started with my grandfather, Richard Doc Whipple, Grandpa Whipple. Grandpa Whipple was kind of everything to me. He raised me until I was about 12. Um, there he is with our dog Elmer, and I was about 4 in that picture. Unfortunately, our family, I think they struggled with photographs. You can see a couple of the photographs in here are quite blurry. Grandpa Whipple got married in 1933. There he is with my grandmother Dorothy. There he is in his basketball uniform from high school. I have all these images of Grandpa, and I have memories of him, and I still have questions about him. Grandpa was connected to history, our history, in that he was in the Navy. He was drafted into the Navy during World War II. And unfortunately, in his second year, his ship, the USS Extractor, was sunk by a US submarine, and a couple of people died during that event. It was a fairly traumatic event for him, one that he would not talk about. I only remember one time in my life where he spoke about the event, and he didn't go into a lot of detail. But there's a connection between my grandfather and U.S. history through World War II. And so those connections always made me more curious about our history as a country and about our family. Grandpa grew up, raised a family, and eventually passed away when I was only about 11 years old. And so, unfortunately, I didn't get to ask him or my grandmother a lot of questions about him, about his connection to some historical events, and about our family. And I think those questions, looking back into my history and my desire to define myself and my family history, has always made me curious about history in general. Um, I've also had curiosity as I grew older about events of the past and what really happened. Are things the way we see them, or did things occur in ways that there's more to the story? And one of the things that always garnered my interest was the Kennedy assassination. I learned about that probably when I was about 8 years old, and seems a little odd, but it's not something anybody in our family ever spoke about. And this was only about 10 years after it occurred. My family would talk on end about current political situations. They had a supreme dislike for Richard Nixon. Most of my family were Democrats, and they didn't like Nixon. I had never heard of Kennedy, and I asked about him. And my grandma said, "Well, there's a book about him getting shot," and it actually turned out to be this book, the official Warren Commission report. And so at 8, I started to delve into the Warren report and read about President Kennedy. And I think some of the factual evidence in there drove me to create my own conclusions about the assassination. And it also drove me to want facts and evidence about other things in history. And then there are connections. As I said, there's one thing my grandfather wouldn't talk about, and it was the sinking of his ship. Another was the Kennedy assassination. And I always found that kind of odd because in our, I guess, archives, things we kept, my grandparents kept the newspapers from the day the president was shot. They kept several Look and Life magazines. And my grandfather, I added this just because it's kind of curious, actually filled out the crossword puzzle in the paper that day. So maybe the assassination upset him so much that he went into a shell, sat there, filled out the crossword, and kind of checked out. But he never really talked about it. And as I grew up, I came to realize that he and President Kennedy were the same age. My grandfather was a Democrat. He probably believed and liked Kennedy quite a good deal. And it probably did upset him, the assassination. And so it's probably why it's something he didn't want to talk about, because he didn't want to get upset. And I didn't understand that when I was 10, but as I grew to be an adult, I certainly I certainly came to understand where he could be coming from. But again, connections between how my family felt and our history, not just our family history, but world and U.S. history, and how they impacted the feelings of my family, have always made me more curious about history in general. And so it led me to eventually become a history teacher. I teach history at a middle school in Washington State. Um, and I like taking my curiosity and my quest for knowledge and trying to impart that on my students. And hopefully they come away with a desire to learn more about their past and how it affects their lives and their future. Um, so, why history? The conclusion is basically so I can answer old questions and so I can come up with new questions. So I can take things from the past about the history of our country and the world, tie them into things about the past and the history of my family, how they affected my family, and how they've affected me and made me the person I am and helped define me. And hopefully, I can continue to do those things and help others learn more about themselves.